In the year 2025, the world fell silent, not with the explosive finality of a war, nor the creeping decay of disease. It was quiet. One day, people were simply gone. Houses stood as they were, meals half-eaten on tables, cars abandoned at stoplights. Everything was still. Evelyn Monroe was one of the last to notice. A recluse by nature, she lived on the outskirts of Portland in a cabin surrounded by towering pines. For years, her job as a remote programmer kept her connected to the outside world without ever needing to see it. But when her clients stopped emailing and her news apps stopped updating, she thought little of it. Maybe there was some outage, a technical glitch. She always enjoyed the quiet anyway, but the quiet grew deeper. Days stretched into weeks without deliveries, planes overhead, or the distant hum of traffic. Curiosity tugged at her until, finally, she left her sanctuary to see what had happened. The first sign was the highway. Cars sat abandoned, doors wide open, keys still in the ignition. A Starbucks cup rolled lazily in the breeze by one car, still half full with iced coffee. Evelyn frowned, her stomach knotting. Where were the drivers? Where were the bodies? Her phone's GPS still worked, so she followed the route to Portland. The city was worse. Streets were empty, office buildings dark, stores looted but eerily clean, as though something more than humans had passed through. Not a single sound greeted her, save for her own footsteps and the wind howling through the empty corridors. She found herself standing in Pioneer Courthouse Square, staring at the towering screens that once broadcasted news and ads. They now flickered with static. And then, just as she was about to turn away, the static changed. Words appeared on the screen in stark white letters. Do you see them too? Evelyn froze. Her heart pounded so loud it drowned out everything else. She whipped around, expecting anyone, but the square was empty. She turned back to the screen, but it had gone black again. Her gut told her to leave, but something stronger, a terrible curiosity, pushed her forward. She searched the buildings, finding signs of life but no people. Open journals, half-written to-do lists, and hastily dropped phones lay scattered everywhere. It was as if humanity had fled mid-thought. That night, Evelyn made camp in an empty hotel. She locked every door and window, but sleep wouldn't come. As she lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, she felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. At first, she told herself it was her imagination, but then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing from the hall outside her room. Her breath caught as shadows moved under the doorframe. "Who's there?" she whispered, voice trembling. No answer, only the creak of the floorboards and a low, guttural sound, like breathing but not human. She didn't sleep that night. By morning, the shadows were gone, but their presence lingered. Evelyn knew she wasn't alone. In the days that followed, she kept moving, searching for survivors. The static screens became more frequent, each flashing messages that chilled her to the bone. Don't look at them. They know you're here. It's too late for us. And she started to see them, flickers at the edge of her vision, impossible shapes that disappeared when she turned her head. But they were there, always watching, always waiting. Evelyn pieced together what little she could, from the journals, the scattered notes, and the cryptic warnings. It seemed that humanity hadn't died. It had been taken, pulled into some unseen realm by beings who fed on attention, who thrived on being noticed. The more you saw them, the closer they came. One journal contained a final, frantic scrawl. Don't look. Don't think about them. Forget them, or they'll take you too. But it was impossible. Once you knew, you couldn't unknow. Once you saw, you couldn't unsee. Evelyn's days turned into a game of survival. She avoided reflective surfaces, refused to linger in the shadows, and tried to keep her thoughts empty. But the messages on the screens followed her. The footsteps at night grew louder. And then, on February 14th, she woke to find a message scratched into the wall above her bed. "You're the last one." Evelyn stared at the words, her breath hitching. She wanted to run, but where? There was nowhere left to go. The world wasn't just empty, it was hunting her. That night, she gave in. She sat in the center of an empty park, her flashlight flickering weakly in the darkness. "I know you're there," she whispered. Her voice echoed into the void. "Come and get me." The shadows moved, dozens of them, hundreds. They poured out of the trees, the buildings, the very ground itself, twisting, shifting, shapes that defied logic or form. As they closed in, Evelyn felt no fear, only relief. She had spent weeks running, hiding, and fearing the inevitable. Now, it was over. The last thing she saw was their faces, or what could only be called faces, pressing in from all directions, grinning with mouths far too wide. And then, silence. The year 2025 didn't end with an explosion or a whisper. It ended with a grin that stretched across the empty cities, the abandoned highways, and the hollow earth. For in the end, humanity wasn't destroyed. It was consumed, and the world was left for them. Evelyn's story was meant to end there, but it didn't. Somewhere in the vast emptiness of the world, she opened her eyes. At first, she thought she had awoken in the afterlife, if such a thing existed. The air was thick, heavy with an unnatural pressure, and the sky above wasn't blue, but a sickly, swirling gray. Shapes moved in the sky, vast, grotesque forms too large and incomprehensible to look at directly. She tried to move, but found her body frozen. Around her, the shadows gathered, whispering in a language that scraped at her sanity. Her head throbbed as their words burrowed into her mind like worms. "You don't belong here. You're not one of them. Why are you still human?" The questions weren't spoken aloud but reverberated inside her skull, their voices clawing at the edges of her thoughts. Evelyn struggled against the invisible force that held her, her breath shallow and labored. Then, in the distance, she saw them. Figures faint and distorted, stumbling through the endless gray wasteland. Humans, or what was left of them. Their forms flickered like broken holograms, their faces blurred as though erased by time itself. They wandered aimlessly, whispering to themselves, their voices faint echoes of despair. Evelyn realized with horror that these were the remnants of humanity, those who had been taken. Their bodies were here, but their minds had been devoured, leaving only hollow shells. The shadows around her seemed agitated now. Their whispers grew louder, sharper, and she felt the grip on her body begin to loosen. "You don't belong." With a sudden, violent shove, the shadows hurled her backward. Evelyn screamed as the gray world dissolved around her, and she fell into darkness. When she awoke again, she was back in the empty park. The sky above was blue, the air still and quiet. But something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones. The world looked the same, but it wasn't. The shadows weren't gone. They were watching her, lurking just out of sight, waiting for her to slip. She could feel their presence in every corner, every reflection. And the screens, oh, the screens. They were everywhere now, glowing with messages meant only for her. "You're not safe. They will return. You're not alone." The whispers followed her everywhere, growing louder with each passing day. She avoided mirrors and shiny surfaces, but it didn't matter. She could see them in her mind. Their grinning faces burned into her memory. And then she noticed the changes. Her reflection, when she dared to glance at it, was no longer her own. Her eyes seemed darker, her face thinner, her smile wrong. It wasn't her smile. She tried to keep moving, to find some semblance of normalcy in a world that was anything but. But as the days turned into weeks, she realized she wasn't just being hunted. She was becoming one of them. Evelyn's thoughts began to blur, her memories slipping away like sand through her fingers. She would wake in strange places with no recollection of how she got there. Sometimes, she caught glimpses of herself in reflective surfaces, standing behind her, grinning with that too wide smile. One day, as she wandered the ruins of a deserted mall, she found a screen that wasn't like the others. It didn't display cryptic warnings or ominous questions. Instead, it showed her own face, staring back at her with lifeless eyes. Beneath her reflection, a single line of text appeared. "Welcome home," Evelyn screamed, but no sound came out. The reflection leaned closer, pressing its hands against the inside of the screen as though trying to break through. And then, with a shattering crack, it did. She ran, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows closed in around her, their whispers now deafening. Her reflection followed, its movements jerky and unnatural, its grin widening until it split its face in two. Evelyn stumbled and fell, the darkness swallowing her whole. The next morning, the world seemed no different. The sun rose, the wind blew, and the cities remained silent. But in the empty park where Evelyn had once stood, a new shadow lingered, a figure with hollow eyes and a grin far too wide. It stood motionless, watching, waiting, and on a nearby screen, a new message flickered to life. "Who's next?"